The smell of fresh seafood and ocean breeze filled the air at Ocean View Restaurant as another busy Saturday evening kicked into high gear. The place was packed with families celebrating anniversaries, couples on romantic dates, and groups of friends catching up over dinner. The soft sound of jazz music mixed with laughter and conversation created that perfect restaurant atmosphere that kept customers coming back week after week. James had been wiping down tables and setting up for the dinner rush since 3 in the afternoon. At 28 years old, he moved through the restaurant with the kind of smooth confidence that only comes from years of experience. He knew exactly which tables preferred extra bread, which customers liked their water glasses refilled before they even asked, and how to handle difficult situations with a smile that never seemed forced. The other servers respected him. The kitchen staff trusted him to get orders right. Even the manager, Patricia, often turned to him when things got hectic. James had that rare combination of genuine warmth and professional skill that made him one of the best servers the restaurant had ever had. But tonight felt different somehow. Maybe it was the way the wind was picking up outside, making the palm trees sway more dramatically than usual, or maybe it was just one of those nights when you could sense that something was about to happen. The hostess, a college student named Amy, approached him with a slightly worried expression on her face. She held 4 menus in her hands and kept glancing toward the entrance. "James, I need to seat this group at table 12, she said quietly. "But I have to warn you, they've been kind of difficult since they walked in. They complained about the wait time even though we told them it would be 20 minutes. Then they made some comments about the music being too loud, even though it's the same volume we always keep it at." James looked over toward the entrance where 4 middle-aged tourists stood looking around the restaurant like they owned the place. The men wore expensive polo shirts and khaki shorts, while the women had on designer sundresses and carried handbags that probably cost more than most people made in a month. They had that particular look of people who were used to getting their way and weren't afraid to make a scene if they didn't. "Don't worry about it," James told Amy with his usual calm smile. "I've handled worse. Just seat them and I'll take good care of them." Amy nodded but still looked concerned as she led the group to their table. James watched from across the room as she showed them to their seats by the window. Even from a distance, he could see them examining everything with critical eyes. One of the men picked up his water glass and held it up to the light, checking for spots. One of the women wiped down her chair with a napkin before sitting down. James finished setting up table 15 and made his way over to greet his new customers. As he approached, he could hear snippets of their conversation. "I don't know why we came to this part of town," one woman was saying. "The Marriott concierge said this place was supposed to be good, but look at this tablecloth. It has a tiny stain right here." "Well, we're here now," one of the men replied. "Let's just hope the service is better than what we've experienced so far in this city." James took a deep breath and approached their table with his professional smile in place. "Good evening, folks. Welcome to Ocean View Restaurant. My name is James, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. How are you all doing?" The group looked up at him with expressions that weren't exactly unfriendly, but weren't warm either. It was more like they were evaluating him, deciding whether he was worth their time and attention. "We're fine," said the older man who seemed to be the leader of the group. He had gray hair and wore wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like he might be a professor or businessman. "We'd like to start with drinks. Do you have a wine list?" "Absolutely," James replied, pulling out the leather-bound wine menu from under his arm. "We have an excellent selection of local wines as well as some wonderful imports. Are you celebrating anything special tonight?" The man took the wine list without really acknowledging the question. He flipped through it quickly, his eyebrows raising at the prices. "These prices are ridiculous for a place like this. What do you recommend that won't break the bank?" James maintained his pleasant demeanor. "Well, our house red is very popular. It's a local vineyard that's won several awards. The price point is very reasonable, and I think you'd really enjoy it. Or if you prefer white wine, our Chardonnay pairs beautifully with our seafood dishes." One of the women leaned over to look at the menu. "Local wine? Is that code for cheap wine? We're used to drinking real wines, not whatever they make in someone's backyard around here." The comment stung, but James had heard worse over the years. He kept his smile steady. "I understand your concern, but I think you'd be surprised by the quality. The vineyard has been featured in several national magazines, and the winemaker actually trained in France. But if you'd prefer, we also have an excellent selection of California wines and some European options. The group exchanged glances that James couldn't quite read. There was something in their expressions that made him feel like they were sharing some kind of private joke at his expense. "Fine," the man said dismissively. "Bring us a bottle of the house red. But if it's terrible, we're sending it back." "Of course, sir. I'm confident you'll enjoy it." James made a note on his pad. "Have you had a chance to look at our appetizer menu? Our calamari is fantastic, and we also have some wonderful local oysters that just came in this morning." "We'll look at the food menu when we're ready," one of the other women said sharply. "Just get the wine for now." As James walked away from the table, he could feel their eyes following him. When he was about halfway to the bar, he heard one of them say something that made him pause. The words weren't meant for him to hear, but the acoustics in the restaurant carried voices in unexpected ways. "Well, at least he speaks clearly," one woman said with a slight laugh. "You never know what you're going to get these days." James felt his jaw tighten slightly, but he continued walking. He'd learned long ago that the best way to handle comments like that was to focus on providing excellent service and let his professionalism speak for itself. At the bar, he placed the wine order with Carlos, the bartender who had become a good friend over the years they'd worked together. "How's table 12 looking?" Carlos asked as he retrieved the bottle from the wine cooler. "They seem like they might be a little challenging," James admitted quietly, "but nothing I can't handle. Just keep an eye out in case I need backup." Carlos nodded knowingly. After working in restaurants for over a decade, he could spot difficult customers from across the room. "You got it, man. Just give me a signal if things get weird." James returned to the table with the wine, going through the traditional ritual of showing the label and pouring a small taste for approval. The man swirled the wine in his glass, sniffed it dramatically, and took a sip with the exaggerated gestures of someone who wanted everyone to know he was an expert. "It's acceptable," he said finally, as if he was doing James a tremendous favor. As James poured wine for the rest of the table, he noticed the group's conversation had shifted to discussing their vacation plans. They talked about the expensive resort they were staying at, the exclusive tours they had booked, and the high-end restaurants they planned to visit in other cities. But there was something else in their tone, something that made James increasingly uncomfortable as the evening went on. They seemed to take pleasure in pointing out everything they found lacking about the city, the restaurant, and the people they encountered. It was like they were collecting stories to tell their friends back home about how much better things were where they came from. James had a feeling this was going to be a long night. As the evening wore on, what started as mild rudeness slowly began to transform into something much worse. James had dealt with demanding customers before, but this group seemed determined to test every limit of his patience and professionalism. When he returned to take their food orders, the group was deep in conversation about their morning activities. They had apparently spent the day on a guided tour of the historic district, and their comments about the experience were getting louder and more inappropriate by the minute. The tour guide barely spoke English, one of the women was saying with an exaggerated shake of her head. "I mean, how are we supposed to understand the history when we can't even understand what he's saying?" "That's nothing," replied the man who seemed to be her husband. "Did you see the condition of some of those old buildings? They should just tear them down and build something modern. No wonder property values are so low around here." James cleared his throat politely to get their attention. "Excuse me, folks. Are you ready to order? Or would you like a few more minutes with the menu?" The group looked up at him with expressions that had grown noticeably colder since his last visit to their table. The wine had clearly loosened their tongues, and whatever filter they might have had earlier was rapidly disappearing. Finally, one woman muttered, "We've been waiting forever." James checked his watch quickly. It had been exactly 7 minutes since he'd poured their wine. "I apologize if it seemed like a long wait. What can I get started for you this evening?" The older man pointed at the menu without looking up at James. "I want the lobster, but I want it cooked properly. Not too soft, not too tough. Think you can handle that?" "Absolutely, sir. Our chef has been preparing lobster for over 15 years. How would you like it prepared?" "We have it grilled, steamed, or in our signature garlic butter sauce. Just make sure it's done right," the man said dismissively. "I don't want to have to send it back like we had to do at that disaster of a restaurant last night." James made a note and turned to the woman sitting next to him. "And for you, ma'am?" "I want the salmon, but I have very specific requirements," she began, launching into a list of modifications that would essentially change the entire dish. No sauce, no seasoning except salt, cooked exactly medium, not a second more or less. And I want the vegetables on a separate plate because I don't want any of the fish juices touching them. As James wrote down her complicated order, he heard one of the other customers at a nearby table whisper to their companion, "Are they serious right now?" The third member of the group, a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, interrupted before James could ask what she wanted. "Before we finish ordering, I need to ask you something. Do you people actually wash these glasses properly? Because mine has spots all over it." James looked at the glass she was holding up. It appeared perfectly clean to him, but he knew better than to argue. "I'd be happy to get you a fresh glass, ma'am. Sometimes the lighting can make clean glasses look spotty." "It's not the lighting," she snapped. "It's the quality of your dishwashing. Where I come from, restaurants take pride in clean glassware." The comment hung in the air for a moment. Other diners at nearby tables had started to notice the conversation, and James could feel their eyes on him. He maintained his professional composure, but inside he felt a familiar tightness in his chest that he'd experienced too many times before. "I'll get you a new glass right away," he said calmly. "What would you like to order for your main course?" As he took the rest of their orders, the group's behavior continued to deteriorate. They made comments about everything from the temperature of the room to the music selection, always phrasing their complaints in ways that seemed designed to make James feel somehow responsible for every aspect of their experience. When he walked away to place their order with the kitchen, James overheard more of their conversation. This time they weren't even trying to lower their voices. "I don't understand why they put people like him in positions where they have to interact with customers," one woman said. "Wouldn't he be better suited for the kitchen or cleaning tables?" "Maybe that's just how they do things around here," replied her companion. "Different standards, I suppose." James felt his hands clench involuntarily, but he forced himself to keep walking. He'd learned early in his career that responding to comments like that only made things worse. The best approach was to provide such excellent service that customers would feel foolish about their assumptions. But as the evening progressed, the group seemed to interpret his professionalism as an invitation to push even further. When he brought their salads, one man deliberately knocked his water glass over and then looked at James expectantly. "Well?" the man said. "Are you going to clean that up?" James immediately grabbed some napkins and began soaking up the water. "No problem at all, sir. Let me get you a fresh glass of water." As he cleaned up the spill, he heard the man say to his companions, "At least he knows his place." The comment hit James like a physical blow, but he continued cleaning without responding. Around them, other diners were starting to stare more openly. A couple at the next table over looked shocked and uncomfortable. When James returned with a new glass of water and fresh napkins, the group's behavior took another turn for the worse. One of the women had taken out her phone and was openly filming him as he served their food. "Smile for the camera," she said with a laugh. "We're documenting our vacation experience. You're going to be famous on social media." James felt deeply uncomfortable being filmed without his consent, but he knew that asking them to stop might only escalate the situation. Instead, he continued serving their meal with as much dignity as he could manage. "Your lobster, sir," he said, placing the plate in front of the older man. "Chef says it's cooked to perfection." The man cut into the lobster and took a bite, chewing slowly and deliberately. James waited for his reaction, hoping that at least the food would meet their standards. "It's overcooked," the man announced loudly. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. Can your kitchen not follow simple instructions?" James looked at the lobster. It appeared perfectly cooked to him, with the meat white and tender. But he knew there was no point in arguing. "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me have the chef prepare you a new one immediately." "Don't bother," the man said with a dramatic wave of his hand. "I've lost my appetite. This is exactly the kind of service we expected from a place like this." The woman with the phone was still recording, capturing every moment of the interaction. "This is going to get so many views," she said to her friends. "People love watching stuff like this." James felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. Being filmed during what was supposed to be a private interaction at work felt like a violation. But he knew he had to maintain his professionalism. "Sir, I really would like to make this right," James said quietly. "Please let me get the manager so we can fix this situation." "The manager?" The man laughed. "What's the manager going to do? Train you people properly? We both know that's not going to happen." The casual cruelty of the comment, delivered with such confidence, finally broke through James's professional facade for just a moment. The other customers in the restaurant had all stopped their own conversations to watch what was happening. Some looked angry, others seemed embarrassed to be witnessing the scene. James took a deep breath and made a decision that would change the entire course of the evening. Instead of getting flustered or defensive, he did something that none of them expected. He smiled. Not the forced smile of customer service, but a genuine, knowing smile that seemed to contain secrets they couldn't begin to guess at. "You know what?" James said calmly. "You're absolutely right. Let me get you the check so you can enjoy the rest of your evening." The group looked confused by his reaction. They had clearly been expecting him to get upset or defensive. His calm acceptance of their behavior seemed to throw them off their game. But James wasn't done yet. As he walked away from their table, he made a quick decision that would soon teach them a lesson they would never forget. The evening was about to take a turn that none of them, especially the rude tourists, could have possibly anticipated. The real show was just getting started. James walked away from table 12 with that mysterious smile still playing on his lips. The other diners watched him go, some shaking their heads in disgust at what they had witnessed, others clearly impressed by how he had maintained his composure under such horrible treatment. But James wasn't heading to get their check like he had promised. Instead, he made his way to the back office where Patricia, the restaurant manager, was doing paperwork. "Patricia," he said, knocking gently on the open door. "I need to step away from table 12 for just a moment. Can you keep an eye on them?" Patricia looked up from her computer screen. She had been watching the situation unfold from across the restaurant, and her face showed a mixture of anger and concern. "James, I saw what was happening out there. I was about to come over and ask them to leave. That behavior is completely unacceptable. No one should have to put up with that kind of treatment." James held up a hand to stop her. "I appreciate that, but I have a better idea. Trust me on this one. Can you just make sure they don't leave for the next few minutes?" Patricia looked puzzled but nodded. "Of course. But James, you don't have to take abuse from customers. I don't care how much money they spend." "I know," James replied, "and I'm not going to. Just give me 5 minutes." He walked to his locker in the employee break room and retrieved something that had been sitting in there for the past 3 years. It was a simple brown leather portfolio, worn at the edges from years of use. Inside were documents that told a very different story about who James really was. As he made his way back toward the dining room, James thought about the conversation he'd had with his thesis advisor just that morning. Dr. Richardson had called to check on his research progress, reminding him that his dissertation on workplace discrimination in the service industry was due in just 2 months. "How's the fieldwork going?" Dr. Richardson had asked. "Are you getting the kind of real-world examples you need for your research?" James had laughed at the time. "Let's just say I'm getting more material than I bargained for." What the rude tourist didn't know was that James wasn't just any waiter. He had been working at Ocean View Restaurant for 3 years as part of an extensive research project for his doctoral degree in sociology from the State University. His dissertation focused on how discrimination played out in everyday service interactions, and he had been documenting hundreds of encounters over the years. But James wasn't just a graduate student either. Before returning to school to pursue his PhD, he had worked for 10 years as a civil rights investigator for the state's Human Rights Commission. He had testified in court cases, written policy recommendations, and helped draft legislation aimed at protecting workers from exactly the kind of treatment he had just experienced. The brown portfolio contained copies of his published research papers, his investigator credentials, and letters of recommendation from judges, lawmakers, and university professors who respected his work. It also contained something else that would be very relevant to the current situation: a business card for his consulting firm, which specialized in helping businesses train their staff to recognize and respond to discriminatory behavior. As James approached table 12, he could see that the group was getting more animated in their conversation. The woman with the phone was still recording, and they seemed to be enjoying themselves immensely as they discussed how they would caption the video when they posted it online. "This is going to be hilarious," one woman was saying. "We should call it When Service Workers Don't Know Their Place or something like that. Or Why We Don't Eat at Local Restaurants Anymore," added her husband. "Our friends back home are going to love this," James cleared his throat as he approached their table. The group looked up at him with expressions of amusement, clearly expecting him to return with their check and maybe an apology. Instead, James pulled out one of the chairs at their table and sat down. The action was so unexpected that the entire group fell silent. Other diners in the restaurant turned to watch, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "I'm sorry," said the older man, his voice full of indignation. "What do you think you're doing? We didn't invite you to sit down." James opened his leather portfolio and carefully removed a business card, which he placed in the center of the table where all four tourists could see it clearly. "My name is Dr. James Washington," he said in a calm, professional voice that was completely different from his earlier customer service tone. "I have a PhD in sociology from the State University, and I specialize in workplace discrimination and civil rights law." The group stared at the business card in confusion. One woman picked it up and read it aloud. "Dr. James Washington, Civil Rights Consultant and Research Associate, State University Sociology Department." "I don't understand," said the man who had been leading the group's rude behavior. "You're a waiter. What are you talking about?" James smiled that same mysterious smile. "I am indeed working as a waiter, but that's only part of the story. For the past 3 years, I've been conducting ethnographic research on discrimination in the service industry. I've been documenting interactions between customers and service workers to better understand how prejudice manifests in everyday situations." The woman who had been filming suddenly looked much less confident. She slowly lowered her phone, though she kept it recording. "Every interaction I have with customers becomes part of my research data," James continued. "I've been taking detailed notes on customer behavior, recording patterns of discriminatory treatment, and analyzing how assumptions about race, class, and education play out in restaurants like this one." He pulled out a small notebook from his portfolio and flipped through several pages covered with neat, academic handwriting. "For example," he said, reading from his notes, "tonight I documented several instances of customers making assumptions about my intelligence, education level, and social status based purely on my appearance and job title. I recorded comments about whether I was suited for customer interaction, observations about my speaking ability, and suggestions that I would be better placed in less visible positions." The group exchanged uncomfortable glances. The man who had been so confident earlier now looked like he was struggling to process this new information. "You were taking notes on us?" one woman asked weakly. "I take notes on all my interactions," James replied matter-of-factly. "It's part of my research methodology, but your table provided particularly rich data for my study." He turned to another page in his notebook. "I also documented the filming without consent, which actually violates several state privacy laws, and the deliberate creation of problems designed to test how service workers respond to manufactured complaints." The woman with the phone quickly stopped recording and put the device away. "Now," James continued, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to presenting research findings, "I should mention that this restaurant is one of several establishments participating in my study. The management is fully aware of my research and they've been very supportive of the project." Patricia appeared beside their table as if on cue. "Dr. Washington, is everything all right here? Do you need me to call campus security?" The tourists looked back and forth between James and Patricia, clearly struggling to understand how the dynamic had shifted so completely. "I think we're fine, Patricia." "Thank you," James replied. "I was just explaining to these folks about my research project." One of the men at the table finally found his voice. "Look, if we said anything offensive, we didn't mean anything by it. We were just having a conversation." James nodded thoughtfully. "That's actually a very common response that I've documented in my research. People often claim their discriminatory behavior was unintentional when confronted with the consequences. It's a fascinating psychological defense mechanism." He flipped to another section of his notebook. "But the interesting thing about unconscious bias is that it reveals our true assumptions about other people. The comments you made tonight tell me far more about your worldview than they do about my qualifications or capabilities." The table had gone completely silent. Around the restaurant, other diners were straining to hear the conversation, and some had pulled out their own phones to record this unexpected turn of events. James wasn't finished yet. The lesson he was about to teach them would be one they would remember for the rest of their lives. James closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair, studying the four tourists who now looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. The confident, demanding attitude they had displayed all evening had completely evaporated, replaced by embarrassment and confusion. "You know," James said thoughtfully, "this situation reminds me of a case study I presented at the National Sociology Conference last year. It was about how people's assumptions about service workers reveal their own prejudices and insecurities." He reached into his portfolio again and pulled out a printed copy of a research paper. The title across the top read, "Hidden Hierarchies, Class, Race, and Dignity in American Service Industries" by Dr. James Washington. "This was published in the Journal of Applied Sociology," he said, sliding the paper across the table. "It won the Research Excellence Award from the American Sociological Association. The study examined over 1,000 interactions between customers and service workers across 12 different cities." The older man picked up the paper with shaking hands and stared at the academic credentials listed below James's name. The list was impressive: PhD in sociology, master's in public policy, bachelor's degree summa cum laude, multiple research fellowships, and a long list of published articles. "One of the most interesting findings," James continued, "was how customers who displayed discriminatory behavior almost always justified it by claiming they had high standards or were trying to ensure good service. But the data showed that these same customers were consistently satisfied with identical service when it was provided by workers who fit their preconceptions about who belonged in certain roles." A woman at the neighboring table had been listening to the conversation, and she spoke up. "Excuse me, but are you really Dr. Washington? I think I attended one of your lectures at the community college last year. You spoke about workplace discrimination." James turned to her with a genuine smile. "Yes, I remember that talk. We discussed how discrimination often hides behind seemingly reasonable complaints about service quality." The woman nodded enthusiastically. "That's right. You showed those statistics about how customer complaints correlated with the demographics of service workers. It was eye-opening." The tourists looked even more uncomfortable as they realized that other people in the restaurant recognized James as a respected academic and researcher. "Dr. Washington," said another diner from across the room, "I read your article in the newspaper about the new anti-discrimination training program for local businesses. Are you the one who helped design that?" "I am," James replied. "The city council asked me to develop a comprehensive program to help local businesses create more inclusive environments for both workers and customers. It's been quite successful." The rude tourists were now getting a very public education about exactly who they had been treating so poorly. But James wasn't done with his lesson. "You see," he said, turning back to their table, "what happened here tonight is a perfect example of what sociologists call attribution error. You made assumptions about my education, intelligence, and social worth based on limited information about my job title and appearance." He opened his notebook again and began reading from his earlier observations. "When you questioned whether I could handle cooking a lobster properly, you revealed an assumption that service workers lack competence. When you suggested I would be better suited for kitchen work or cleaning tables, you revealed a belief in job hierarchies that place some forms of work above others." The man who had sent back the perfectly cooked lobster shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Look, I didn't mean to offend anyone. We're just used to a certain level of service." "That's another fascinating response I've documented," James said, making a note in his book. "The deflection to standards rather than acknowledgement of discriminatory assumptions. But here's what's interesting about your comment regarding service standards." He reached into his portfolio and pulled out another document. "This is a letter from the Regional Restaurant Association, recognizing me as Server of the Year 3 years running. I've also received customer service awards from the State Tourism Board and commendations from the Better Business Bureau." The tourists stared at the certificates James laid out on the table. Each one bore official seals and signatures praising his exceptional service, professionalism, and dedication to customer satisfaction. "So when you complained about the service or suggested I didn't know how to do my job properly, you were actually criticizing someone who has been recognized as one of the best servers in the state," James explained calmly. A young couple at a nearby table started clapping slowly, and soon other diners joined in. The applause grew until most of the restaurant was showing their appreciation for how James had handled the situation. "But here's the most important part of tonight's lesson," James said as the applause died down. This isn't really about my credentials or achievements. The issue is that every service worker deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their education level or background. He leaned forward slightly, his voice becoming more serious. The young man who busses tables here is working his way through community college. The woman who seated you tonight is studying to become a teacher. The cook who prepared your food has been supporting his family with his culinary skills for 20 years. James gestured around the restaurant. Every person working here has their own story, their own dreams, their own struggles. They all deserve the same basic respect that you would want for yourselves or your children. The woman who had been filming earlier looked like she was about to cry. "We had no idea," she whispered. "We just thought." "You thought what?" James asked gently. "That service workers are somehow less deserving of courtesy? That treating people poorly is acceptable if they can't fight back?" The table fell silent again. Around them, other diners continued to watch and listen, many nodding in agreement with James's words. "I want to share something else with you," James continued. "Earlier tonight, when you were discussing your tour of the historic district and complaining about the tour guide's accent, you were talking about my colleague Roberto. He's a doctoral candidate in American history who speaks 4 languages fluently. His tours are consistently rated as the best in the city because he brings actual scholarly expertise to his presentations." The tourists looked stricken. They were beginning to understand the full scope of how wrong their assumptions had been. "Roberto and I often discuss our research together," James said. "He's documenting how tourists interact with local cultural sites, while I'm studying service industry discrimination. We've actually written several papers together about how prejudice manifests in different hospitality settings." He pulled out his phone and showed them a photo of him and Roberto at an academic conference, both wearing formal business attire and presenting their research to a room full of professors and policymakers. "The man whose English you questioned earlier today has published more research on American history than most college professors," James said quietly. "But you dismissed him because his accent didn't match your expectations." The lesson James was teaching was clearly hitting its mark. The 4 tourists looked devastated as they began to understand the full implications of their behavior and attitudes. But James wasn't finished yet. The most powerful part of his lesson was still to come, and it would leave them with something to think about long after they returned home from their vacation. The silence at table 12 stretched on as the weight of James's words settled over the 4 tourists. Around the restaurant, other diners continued to watch, some whispering quietly among themselves about what they had witnessed. James gathered his papers and certificates, placing them carefully back in his portfolio. His movements were deliberate and calm, giving the tourists time to process everything they had learned. "I have a question for you," James said finally, his voice gentle but serious. "When you go home and tell your friends about your vacation, what story are you going to tell about tonight?" The older man who had been leading the group's rude behavior cleared his throat nervously. "Dr. Washington, we owe you a tremendous apology. I don't know what to say. We made terrible assumptions and we treated you horribly. And it wasn't just you," added one of the women, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were rude to the hostess, dismissive of the tour guide, critical of everyone we encountered today. We acted like we were better than everyone here." James nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good start. Self-awareness is the first step toward change. But I want you to understand something important. Apologizing to me doesn't undo the hurt you've caused. It doesn't erase the humiliation you tried to create by filming me without consent, or the way you spoke about entire communities of people." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The real question is, what are you going to do differently going forward?" The woman who had been recording earlier pulled out her phone again, but this time she deleted the video she had taken. "I'm getting rid of this right now. The thought that we were going to post this online and mock you." She shook her head in disgust at her own behavior. "That's a good choice," James said. "But I want you to think about why you were planning to share that video in the first place. What were you hoping to accomplish? What would your friends and family have thought about seeing you treat another person that way?" The question hung in the air. The tourists exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the self-reflection James was asking them to do. "We thought it would be funny," one man admitted reluctantly. "We thought people would laugh at how bad the service was. But now, Now I realize we were planning to humiliate someone who was just trying to do his job. And do it well, added Patricia, the restaurant manager, who had been standing nearby listening to the conversation. Dr. Washington is one of the finest employees we've ever had. Our customers regularly request to be seated in his section because of his exceptional service. James stood up from the table and straightened his server's apron. I want to share something with you that might help you understand the broader impact of what happened tonight. He looked around the restaurant where other diners were still watching and listening. Everyone in this room witnessed how you treated me. Some of them work in service industries themselves. Others are parents trying to teach their children about respect and dignity. A few are business owners who make decisions about who to hire and how to treat their employees. The tourists followed his gaze, suddenly aware of all the eyes on them. Many of the other customers looked disappointed and disgusted by what they had seen. Your behavior tonight didn't just affect me, James continued. It made everyone else in this restaurant uncomfortable. It created a hostile environment for other customers and staff members. It reinforced negative stereotypes about tourists and outsiders that hurt this community's tourism industry. An elderly man at a corner table spoke up. "Excuse me, young man," he said, addressing James. "I want you to know that not all visitors to your city behave this way. My wife and I have been coming here for 15 years, and we've always been impressed by the kindness and professionalism of people like you." His wife nodded in agreement. "We raised our children to treat service workers with respect, because we know how hard those jobs can be. What we witnessed tonight was shameful." Other diners began to voice their support. A family with teenage children used the moment as a teaching opportunity, quietly discussing with their kids why the tourists' behavior had been wrong. A young couple mentioned that they worked in restaurants themselves and knew how painful it was to be treated poorly by customers. The 4 tourists were getting a real-time education in how their behavior had affected not just James, but the entire community of people around them. "I have a proposal," James said, sitting back down at their table. "Instead of just apologizing and moving on, I'd like you to consider turning this experience into something positive." He pulled out another business card and placed it on the table. "This is for the Coastal Community Education Center. They offer workshops on cultural sensitivity and respectful communication. I teach there once a month, along with other community leaders and educators." The tourists looked at the card with interest and surprise. "What if you attended one of these workshops when you get home?" James suggested. "What if you took what you learned tonight and used it to help other people understand how their assumptions and behavior affect others?" The older man picked up the card and studied it carefully. "You want us to take a class about discrimination? After how we behaved tonight, you're still trying to help us?" "That's exactly what I'm doing," James replied. "Because I believe people can change when they understand the impact of their actions. My research has shown that most discriminatory behavior comes from ignorance and unconscious bias, not from malicious intent." He opened his notebook one more time. "Over the past 3 years, I've documented hundreds of interactions like tonight's. But I've also documented remarkable examples of people who recognized their mistakes and made genuine efforts to do better." James showed them a page filled with positive notes and observations. These are stories of customers who came back to apologize, business owners who changed their policies after learning about discrimination, and individuals who became advocates for treating service workers with dignity. The woman who had deleted the video looked up with tears in her eyes. "Is it too late for us to be one of those positive stories?" "It's never too late," James assured her. "But it requires genuine commitment to change, not just feeling sorry about getting caught." Patricia stepped forward with the check for their table. "Your meals tonight are complimentary," she announced. "But we'd like you to consider making a donation to the scholarship fund that Dr. Washington established for local service workers who want to pursue higher education." The tourist looked surprised by the generous offer. "You're not charging us anything after how we acted?" "That's Dr. Washington's decision," Patricia explained. "He asked me to cover your bill because he believes in giving people the chance to do better." The older man pulled out his wallet and placed $200 on the table. "This is for the scholarship fund. And I promise you, we will look into those workshops when we get home." His companions each added money to the pile, creating a substantial donation for the education fund. But James wasn't done yet. He had one more lesson to share that would ensure they never forgot this evening. "Before you leave," he said, "I want you to meet some of the other people you encountered today." To everyone's surprise, Roberto, the tour guide they had criticized earlier, walked into the restaurant. He was no longer in his tour guide uniform but was dressed in a suit and tie. "Roberto is here for our monthly research collaboration meeting," James explained. "Roberto, I'd like you to meet the tourists from your morning tour." Roberto approached the table with a professional smile, despite having overheard some of the conversation. "Hello again. I hope you enjoyed learning about our city's history this morning." The tourists looked mortified as they recognized him. The accent they had mocked was barely noticeable now that they weren't looking for reasons to criticize. "Dr. Rodriguez," James said, "would you mind sharing a bit about your background with our guests?" Roberto nodded graciously. "Of course. I have a PhD in American history from Columbia University. I've been researching the cultural heritage of coastal communities for the past 8 years. The walking tours are part of my community outreach work, helping visitors understand the rich history that makes our city special." The tourists were speechless. They had spent the morning dismissing and mocking someone who was more educated and accomplished than they had imagined possible. "Roberto speaks 4 languages and has consulted on historical preservation projects across the country," James added. "His work has been featured in national museums and academic conferences." The realization of how completely wrong they had been about everyone they had encountered was overwhelming. The older man stood up and extended his hand to Roberto. "Dr. Rodriguez, I owe you a sincere apology. We were incredibly rude during your tour, and we had no right to make assumptions about your qualifications or abilities." Roberto shook his hand graciously. "Apology accepted. I hope you learned something valuable about our city's history, despite the misunderstanding." As the evening wound down, the 4 tourists prepared to leave the restaurant. They had been transformed by the experience, humbled by their mistakes, and committed to doing better in the future. James walked them to the door, his server's apron still tied around his waist. "Remember," he told them quietly, "everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about. Everyone deserves your respect and kindness regardless of their job title or background." The older man shook James's hand one final time. "Dr. Washington, thank you for teaching us this lesson with such grace. We won't forget it." As the group left the restaurant, the other diners erupted in spontaneous applause. James waved acknowledgement but quickly returned to his duties, clearing table 12 and preparing it for the next customers. The story of what happened that night spread quickly through the community and beyond. Videos taken by other diners went viral on social media, but they focused on James's dignity and wisdom, rather than mocking the tourists. News outlets picked up the story as an example of how education and compassion could triumph over prejudice and ignorance. The tourists kept their promise. When they returned home, they enrolled in sensitivity training workshops and became advocates for treating service workers with respect. They shared their story with friends and family, using their experience as a teaching tool for others. James continued his research, using the incident as a powerful case study in his dissertation. His work went on to influence policy changes and training programs across the country. But perhaps most importantly, the evening served as a reminder to everyone who witnessed it, that dignity, respect, and human kindness should never be considered luxuries available only to certain people in certain positions. They are basic rights that belong to everyone, regardless of the work they do or the circumstances of their lives. The lesson James taught that night echoed far beyond the walls of Ocean View Restaurant, reminding people everywhere that we all have the power to choose compassion over prejudice, understanding over assumptions, and respect over superiority. Sometimes the most important education happens outside the classroom, delivered by teachers we never expected in moments that change us forever.